So I'm very grateful to have with me here today two scholars who can help us to think more about how the letters of Paul might be relevant outside just a classroom in a college or university setting, how they might be relevant for a high school curriculum or in general public school education, and how they might be relevant in a world in which there's a lot of violence and misunderstanding around religion. And when I realized that I didn't know enough about this, I also realized with gratitude that I have two colleagues that I could turn to. The first is my colleague Diane Moore, who teaches here at Harvard, and a former student and now teacher, Shauna Pellauer. So let me introduce Diane Moore first, and then Shauna. Diane Moore is a teacher in secondary schools, and she's a senior lecturer here at Harvard, and the author of Overcoming Religious Illiteracy, a cultural studies approach to the study of religion in secondary education. She was also chair of a task force at the American Academy of Religion that worked on religion in the schools. She happens to be an ordained minister as well, and the director of the Religious Literacy Project here at Harvard. Shauna Pellauer is a teacher in a public high school in the English department here in the Boston area, and she has a BA in English and an MTS, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard, and then teacher training, a MAT from Brandeis. So both of them bring a lot of expertise, and we're going to have a conversation in which we cover four basic things. The first is the background or context of teaching the Bible in K through 12th grade in the US. How does this square with the US commitment to separate church and state? The second is to talk about how Diane and Shauna think about the big picture of teaching religion and Bible in classrooms, and about the big picture of the importance of understanding the Bible when we think about the world more broadly. The third is to think very concretely, how do you handle teaching biblical materials in the classroom in a way that's legal and challenging and exciting for students? And finally, we'll think very practically about what are some good resources for thinking about teaching these materials in public schools. So I want to just start then with a very broad question. I'm going to address it to you, Diane. And I ask you to help us to think a little bit about teaching religion in the public schools in the US and how it's not a violation of the traditional separation of church and state. Some of the legal background, anything you could tell us.
Thank you, Laura. This is a wonderful opportunity, so thanks for the invitation. There's a long-standing tradition, actually, of teaching about the Bible in public schools in the United States from the earliest common school era. It was primarily focused on Protestant interpretations of the Bible, intended to be open-ended, to be inclusive, but there was a very Protestant bias that wasn't necessarily named because that was the Protestant culture at the time. And so the Bible was actually taught in K through 12 schools for most of the history of public education. And until 1963, where there were pivotal Supreme Court cases that were responding to the enormous diversity, of course, in our schools and in our country, from longstanding traditions of diversity, but were finally being recognized and brought to the forefront, where there was concern around the religious implications of what was then considered to be common practice, where the Bible was read without comment and the Lord's Prayer was recited. In the Abingdon versus Shemp decision in 1963, challenged the legitimacy of that ruling and said that it was a violation of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment says that we can't establish religion in a context, and we also have to protect the free exercise of religion. But a really important part of that Abingdon-Shemp decision that people don't understand is that they made a very important distinction between the devotional expression of the Bible, teaching about the Bible from a devotionally focused perspective, and the study of the Bible. And if I may, I'd like to read a really important excerpt from Justice Clark's majority view in that Supreme Court case. He says, "One's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization. It certainly may be said that the Bible is worthy of study for its literary and historic qualities. Nothing we have said here indicates that such study of the Bible or of religion, when presented objectively and as part of a secular program of education, may not be affected consistently with the First Amendment." So it's unfortunate that we have this assumption that we can't, because of the separation of church and state, which is often unfortunately misunderstood to mean that we can't ever talk about religion in school. That's not what the First Amendment represents. It means that we can't promote a devotional expression of a particular religious tradition, because that is a violation of the Establishment Clause. But the academic study of religion, the academic study of the Bible, as Justice Clark said here, is really an important dimension of education across all disciplines in K through 12 schools and beyond. So unfortunately, again, that's misunderstood, but it's important for people to understand that it's very legal to teach about the Bible in schools.
And still, I think people might be nervous about how to teach the Bible in schools because no one wants to violate the First Amendment, because no one probably wants to offend students and exclude students. Practically speaking, let me ask you the kind of big picture question of why is it important to teach the Bible in your experience of thinking and writing about it, in your experience actually in the classrooms? What are the concrete benefits of teaching either the Bible or teaching religion in general?
One of the broad picture is that there is a widespread and deep illiteracy about religion in general and the Bible in particular in the United States, but unfortunately that illiteracy really spans the globe. And that there are many consequences to that illiteracy, but I think the most important ones that I'm concerned with, and I think other educators are concerned with, are the civic consequences of that. That misunderstanding religion really does hinder the capacity for people to engage in cooperative endeavors. It enhances bigotry, enhances prejudice, often based on misunderstanding, misperception. And so the civic consequences are, as an educator, are what I'm mostly really concerned about. There are intellectual consequences as well, but the civic dimensions, I think, are most severe. And that you can overcome them. You can address that by helping give teachers the resources they need to recognize the distinction between the devotional expression of religion and the study of religion. And teachers are so tremendously capable of doing this. We just don't usually give them resources to. And then the second is that students are just so excited to learn about religion. It's so relevant to the contemporary challenges we face and the contemporary opportunities we face. But it's difficult for teachers to both have the experience themselves in training about religious studies, and also just challenging for them to find room in the curriculum, and based on those fears again, the sense that they're going to be violating some legal clause, which again, as we've just pointed out, isn't the case. So the kind of big picture, but I know you're doing this really directly in lots of your classes, so I'd love to hear what you're actually doing. How do you approach this in your own classes?
Within our English department, our department head agreed that the sophomore teachers would cover a biblical unit during that particular year. And so we decided many years ago that it would be under the auspices of building cultural literacy. So when they read a poem by John Milton, they'll recognize an allusion. When they read John Donne, they'll have the allusion. When they read Shakespeare, they'll have the allusion. In theory, that's wonderful. And I think that is what comforts a lot of teachers to teach the Bible, because they think, okay, I'm an English teacher, I'm preparing my kids to understand the references in the works that we read. The unfortunate thing about that is a lot of the writers that use the more intensive biblical allusions aren't often covered until 2 years after the unit takes place. And so you can cover these allusions and then you can give a sophomore John Milton, but that's very difficult work. And so in the end, you talk about these stories that will appear, and I try and find poetry and stories and references where they show up. But I think that time lag poses a problem. And one very humbling piece of information that a colleague said to me, and I still don't know what to do with it, he recalls doing a very intensive Bible unit. They went through a variety of stories we typically cover. What this colleague was saying to me is, even after he did this intensive unit where he went through all the stories and they thoroughly spent the time on it, he had these kids 2 years later and did a poem and recalled specifically teaching the allusion, and it wasn't registering. And so then as for me as an educator, I think, okay then, what becomes the larger purpose? And as an English teacher, can I really say that I feel a civic responsibility to do it when there's pressure from the department, pressure from the state, pressure from Common Core to try and do more nonfiction, more non-Western authors, all of which is very important. But when that cultural literacy piece goes away for at least English teachers, I think then we struggle a little bit. But at least for me, I've taught the Bible a variety of different ways. There was one year when I had students pull any translation they wanted because I just wanted them to know the story. So some kids pulled it in Chinese, some kids pulled it from Hebrew. It didn't matter to me. I just wanted story. For kids in advanced classes, I try to have them do either King James, or when we're not doing King James, definitely the Oxford Annotated. I find, at least with my training here at Divinity School, I love teaching it, and I love the murkiness that comes from it, because I feel that we can, if we talk about it, it's better. But I know that if teachers haven't had that experience in training, it's incredibly intimidating.
The example you just gave of having them look at different translations is really interesting. So can you tell us a little bit about how that is helpful or challenging to students in the classroom? What kind of discussions emerge?
At the honors level in my 10th grade class, when we use the same translation, it's to sometimes draw upon issues of translation. Oh, look here, this is the Hebrew word. Those of you who know Hebrew, let's talk about it. This is the Greek word for the New Testament. That I can do. I wish that there were time, always, to just really look at King James, Oxford Annotated, and maybe a third source, whether a devotional type Bible or something used in a faith tradition for a Bible study, that kind of thing, because that could be very interesting.
What do you think is the usefulness when you teach, when you ask students to read the Bible? So one usefulness you've talked about is helping them to understand the literary allusions that, at least in English literature, are informed by the King James Version. But in general, when you see your students, reading the Bible for an assignment, how do you think that's helpful to them, maybe beyond the English literature aspect of it?
I think I really hold on to what you mentioned about the civic point. When I introduce the New Testament with all my students, regardless of level, I say to them over and over that Jesus' last name is not Christ. And to really state right off the bat what I perceive as people not understanding that it's a choice that some traditions make to recognize Jesus of Nazareth as Messiah, and others don't. And so I say to them, okay, we're not going to say words like Old Testament, because that's a value judgment. We're not going to say Jesus Christ, because that's recognizing a persona that not everyone here will recognize. And I think the value of doing that is just to talk about it a little bit. I find it really quite wonderful to have that conversation with students, because all sorts of misconceptions as well as really deeply seated beliefs come to the fore. And it's a unit I try and have a little bit later in the year, so we've built a little bit of comfort. I think it's important. I don't think they have it anywhere else.
And one of the things I love about teaching the Bible is the fact that, first of all, it is one of those texts that people all think they know a whole lot about and actually know very little about, and often have very little exposure to.
Yes.
Students all know that it's an important book, and in my experience, the opportunity to introduce them to, again, the distinction between what some of them may have experienced in their religious lives about a devotional understanding of the Bible, to introduce them to the fact that there are so many different kinds of interpretations of the Bible, as well as different translations. Those sorts of things are so helpful for them, and they get excited because they feel like there's important information that they have that they can actually share and that matters to them. A sense of a complexity of what is often represented so simplistically in their own in culture generally. And the other thing that is so wonderful in my experience is the opportunity to say, well, why do these stories continue to live on? Why is the Bible still so important? And that provides an opportunity for them to start to explore, well, first of all, the power dynamics of historical legacies that continue to recognize the Bible or hold the Bible as meaningful, so we can make links then to their history classes, and that's often the way I teach it, is the kind of multidisciplinary way. They capture, so many of the stories in the Bible capture fundamental human dimensions and fundamental human quandaries that speak to people across the ages in different ways. And then we can start to wrestle with that, with recognizing both diverse interpretations, and interpretations that are culturally and historically specific, and that we in this classroom are culturally and historically specific in this moment as we encounter these timeless texts that have been meaningful across the ages for so many, and anticipate will continue to be. And so there's kind of for me, the excitement that I have in teaching it, and also that my students seem to get energized by, is being able to really see the Bible in a new way. And then for some who just know it's a book and have never cracked it, to just have a chance to understand something and be able to find something meaningful in it, from just again the human dimension. So there's the history, there's the power questions you get to wrestle with, you get to give them language to speak about something that's a challenge, maybe larger and culturally, and to empower them to feel like they could actually speak intelligently about some of those complexities. Has been just such a really wonderful, rich teaching opportunity. It's also what I love about teaching middle and high school levels, because they're at such a cusp of their own development. They're at a cusp of their own identity. They're naming things that matter to them. So so you try to build on that urgency in a sense, and say, first of all, to make a really clear distinction, to anticipate that there will be people who do have deep commitments to these texts with particular kinds of interpretations.
Yeah.
And I won't know that necessarily, but I'll anticipate that that's the case. And I'll anticipate that some people have no cultural experience with these books at all, and others who may have, again, deep experience. So that's really important, to just anticipate that, and try to help then lay a framework to say, for those who do have experience with this, you're going to be exposed to diverse representations, but your experience of this should also be represented among the diversity of ways that we understand the Bible. So if you come from a tradition that really interprets these texts literally, then we'll recognize that as one way that the tradition has lived and that people practice understanding the text. But that's not the only way. And I want to help them understand that by recognizing the legitimacy of other perspectives, including critical historical method, that it's not a diminishment of the theological convictions that they bring to this. And that's a really important distinction to make. And for the most part, people really understand it. Then if we get into it and they do end up feeling frustrated or concerned, then just to be attentive to that and just make sure to take the student aside at some point, or just say, I just want to remind you and just check in. Again, in my experience, if you lay that groundwork clearly and then invite them into real questions about it, not just
So process questions as well as
process questions as
yeah.
well as content questions, but content questions were open-ended about different kinds of interpretations, giving them different experiences of interpretations historically in different moments, or different contemporary interpretations, or different, just literally different translations, and say, well, what's this mean? And how do we understand this then in terms of the history of the Bible? It's never been a singular text. These are we're reading it in English. It's never been written in English. I mean, all those things. And it's just fun because they own it then. There's an ownership of it. There's an ownership of the intellectual complexity of it.
What you all have been talking about reminds me of one way that I talk about it with my students, which is that the text is a stranger. It was written in a different historical context. It's very distant from us. It's almost a way another world that we can live in for a while, kind of inhabit and see the values, the politics, literally the practices of that world, and yet it's also really intimate. And I hear some of that intimacy coming up in two ways in what you're talking about, the intimacy that Diane was talking about, that some of the stories in the Bible, or even as we look at the letters of Paul, some of the ethical issues that arise are, fundamental human concerns, right? They're intimate to us even today as we read them. I was wondering if we could do the thought experiment, and Shauna, maybe since you're in the classroom literally right now, you just came from one, maybe we can start with your thoughts on it. But if you were to kind of do a case study of teaching Philemon, this really, really short half-page letter in a classroom, what are some of the ways we could do that would be challenging and enjoyable at the secondary school level, if you want to think about it like that?
One thing I was thinking of for that, I think it would fit in with a larger conversation about representing the Bible as a library of sorts. And you can go to the library and check out a how-to book, and you can go and check out love poetry, and you can check out story of heroes and conquerors, and this would be the epistolary genre, like what letters are in the Bible too. And so that, I think, could help round out people's perception of actually what's in here. I think many students who are very unfamiliar with the New Testament would be surprised that this sort of thing is in there. I mean, a lot of the preconception is that it's just about Jesus. When I was reading Philemon again, I was thinking to do a genre on how you present persona in a letter. How do you learn about a person through the way that he or she presents in writing? And I noticed in this class you talk about the letter from a Birmingham jail, so looking at that letter, looking at this biblical text, who if we've never met Paul before, who is this person? If you brought him home to have dinner with your family, would they want him there? Why or why not? And for me, one of the ways I like to look at Bible stories is who's vocal and who's silent. And always with each story, we would talk about that. So just recognizing that, and I think the more practice they get of saying, yeah, he's the one who's speaking, but we hear nothing from these other two, and who's Timothy, our brother, and who are these people? I think that that's useful. So my first instinct is not to go to a close textual analysis of it, but I think to look at persona. And then the kids could adapt different personas in writing their own letters. You know, how would you represent yourself writing to our principal as opposed to someone you admire in popular culture or your own family? That type of thing could be interesting. I think in history classes, I mean, just the whole slavery component just screams at me. And I was thinking, if I were a history teacher, this is fantastic research to pull in. And I can't see any curricular connections on that topic right now for me, but using it as a primary source document of sorts, I think would also be really useful. So a lot of different approaches.
One of the challenges I know teachers are facing now is the requirement to cover certain kinds of material that you need to then demonstrate proficiency on, that your students do on tests, but the other side of it is the opportunity that I know teachers really want to embrace more, which is to think in a more cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary way about so many things, and that is actually the kind of critical thinking that is so fostered and celebrated in what we need to be cultivating in education. And yet there are more obstacles in place that don't necessarily allow you to do that. And but these books offer this an incredible opportunity for precisely that kind of cross-disciplinary thinking and learning, and potential teacher collaborations and a whole host of things. So where people can find space and carve out little places, that just again these resources are so tremendously rich for that.
But another way in which I think that a text like Philemon could precisely kind of move into that interdisciplinary understanding would be to think about it, as you say, as a piece of literature in the genre of the epistle. You know, what does it mean to write a letter? Then also to think, what is the history of the ways in which biblical texts were used in American slavery, right? So if you're teaching on American slavery, it's really important to know about the letters of Paul and all the letters that were crafted in his name, because a lot of them do talk about slavery, and they were concretely used in literature in America, in sermons in America. And so that kind of movement back to the Roman context, to this ancient context, might help people think, well, how are texts redeployed today? Not only in literary allusion, right, but also in political context in the public square. How were they used in the antebellum period in the US? So it seems to me, obviously I'm a biblical scholar, I'm going to see the importance of these texts everywhere, but it seems to me like there's a lot of potential for bringing that into classrooms, whether it's history, social studies, or English. I want to turn to a different topic. So we've been thinking a bit about especially how to teach religion in the Bible in a, pretty much a secondary school context was the primary conversation we've been having. And Diane, I wanted to ask you about drawing out to an even bigger lens. So can you tell us a little bit about the religious literacy project that you're directing, and what are some of your hopes for that, and how biblical literacy is a part of religious literacy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So part of the privilege I had to create the guidelines for teaching about religion in K through 12 schools is the task force that you referenced earlier in my introduction, is a guide for K through 12 public school teachers to help them navigate these complicated issues, both legally, but also how to give pointers and ideas about how religion and the Bible is already embedded across the curriculum in so many ways. We liken it actually to gender studies or race ethnicity studies, where we never thought to ask those questions before, but we were making all kinds of assumptions. When we used to approach American history, for example, we'd We would teach American history, and then we might have at the end a week on women in American history, or Americans in American history. And of course now, hopefully, we're better with the integration. Well, religion, we're kind of at that place in religion. We teach religion in this very isolated sphere, in a way like we're going to study all these things, and then we're going to learn about religion, and we're going to learn the Four Noble Truths and the Ten Commandments, and we're going to learn what books are in the Bible, without an understanding of anything beyond a factual or ritual focus, which is not really helpful to understand the religions in a meaningful way. So what we've done through the work here at Harvard is a long history of it, where we actually have programs that also, for people who want to study religion, also have the opportunity to focus some of their studies on what it means to teach about religion in a very explicit way in K through 12 settings. So the Religious Literacy Project is actually a successor to an in-service teacher education program that we'd had here at the Divinity School for several years. And now this is really geared toward, that program was unfortunately suspended, but the current project we have is where we've got our students at the graduate level who are interested in education working in concert with teachers in the field to create resources for teachers in particular contexts, particular disciplines, to help teachers who are teaching history or Spanish or English or elementary school across the disciplines, to help them recognize the ways that religion's already there, and help them lift that up and have a critical lens to understand how to think about religion. And the Bible, of course, is very much part of that entire process, the Bible being so important for American civilization, especially European civilizations. So the intersections with the Bible are legion, and not only in literary allusion, although certainly there. So it's really to help give teachers, again, the resources to start to ask the religion questions, the way we frame it. And it's been just a tremendously rich project, and just the incredible joy it is to work with such capable teachers who are in the schools every day. I'm not so much anymore myself. And to work with graduate students here who are planning to go into education, to be able to have those resources and build on the resources they're learning here through their religious studies training, biblical studies training, and then take that into the context of what it means to teach in a middle secondary classroom. So that's the Religious Literacy Project. Related to that, we have a project that we now are jointly sponsoring through the Harvard Extension School that's aimed at in-service teachers, people across the world really, that they can earn a certificate in religious studies and education, and that they can earn that certificate as distance learners, or they can do it here in-house. But it's essentially a 5-course sequence that helps look at both the method for how to do this, but also the content, as well as the ways to think about the legal implications. So we've got a little bit of the public policy question. That's one of the required courses that I teach. We've got the content that they just get a chance to choose electives for. If they're in the extension school, if they're here at the Divinity School, you just learn that. You just do that in the context of your master's program. And then an opportunity for application in a real classroom. Like, what does it mean to actually do this and put it together and create a syllabus and do the pedagogical challenges and opportunities. So we're excited about having that. We've got a long history here at the Divinity School, 40-year history of being uniquely situated here at the Divinity School to focus on those questions. And so we're really grateful we can continue this legacy of the program in religious studies and education that we unfortunately lost, but we're still have our feet in this area.
When I think about the big picture of why I went into the field, or why I like to teach the letters of Paul, other New Testament texts in the classroom, I think there are a few reasons. The first is the sort of curiosity and the pleasure of historical discovery. It's really exciting to read ancient documents, to think about this strange world in which they were produced, to learn more from these documents about women and slaves and religion and theology and philosophy in the ancient world. And I think it's important to know about other worlds, to acknowledge and to enjoy that historical richness and diversity. Another reason why I think it's really important to teach biblical texts is to help students to understand the kind of range of interpretation that's possible, and to help students, to help myself to hone my sense of responsibility for my own interpretation. And ultimately what I want to do is make sure that all of us in reading and in interpreting the Bible give space for other interpretations and don't do harm with our own interpretations. That's kind of my big picture for why I like to teach this material. And I was just curious about some of the big picture elements for you all when you think about teaching the Bible in the classroom, when you think about how to teach yourself or teach others how to teach. What are the big takeaway points about religion or the Bible in the classroom?
For me, what I hope students take from it is that I want them to see Judaism and Christianity as so much more connected than they at first think. Our school has a pretty high percentage of Jewish kids, many of whom have gone through Hebrew school and sort of feel that they know the Bible. You were mentioning that earlier. Like it's a book that many people feel like they know, even if that's not more or less could be the case. And so I want to allow kids a space to bring in that background knowledge, but to also bring in some historical information to look at it from maybe a different way than they have been able to in their religious traditions. And at the end of the day, to see the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, when I talk about New Testament, to see him as deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition, and to see him as Christian is to do a disservice, is to do harm with the text. And I think I want to do something about that misunderstanding. But that's important to me, I think, on a civic level, that they both recognize that Christianity sprang from that tradition and that there is some commonality in there. I also want them to see a chance to look at the Bible in a different way. So if they're not comfortable seeing it as sacred for whatever reasons, they can look at it as a library, for example, where you would go to the library to check out a variety of different books, from how-to manuals to crossword puzzle books to fiction. And the Bible has stories of heroes, stories of conquerors, kings, etc. So they can see the Bible as sort of Bibles. A little bit of multiplicity, I think, is good. I think anytime we can complicate how kids understand the world, it's a good thing, and ourselves, it's a good thing. And secondarily, to see the Bible as a quilt in a sense, so that you had this source material of patchwork, and quilters have to decide what material to bring in, and those are redactors in a sense. Then you have people who are actually quilting everything together. And I think when you give kids permission to see and to question if that happened with something as important as the Bible, my hope is that they see that that potential for both exclusion and inclusion is present in a lot of the things we hold dear. Who gets a voice, who doesn't? Whose experience is told, whose isn't? And just kind of practicing those types of questions, I think, is really worthwhile. So those are kind of takeaways.
It strikes me, for you as an English teacher, it's a particularly interesting move, because when I was studying English literature, you have the Norton Anthology, which in itself is a kind of canon, right? Yeah. People have decided what to quilt together into that text, and it's a wonderful collection, and I enjoy reading it. But what you're asking them to think about is the ways in which the Bible is similarly a set of texts written at different time periods for different reasons that were eventually collected together, and that they want to think about the politics, the benefits of that collection of the Bible, just as they might want to also think about what is it that they're being asked to read in an English class, and what is the collection that's considered valuable. Yeah. I
love telling them that we have 4 Gospels in the New Testament, and I'll show a Christmas card on a PowerPoint, and I'll say, okay, whose Gospel is this? Not everybody has the little baby in the manger, right? That's a choice. That's a choice that people make. So I find it liberating, and I can only hope that when teachers in the classroom can, I think, approach it with humility, but with curiosity and excitement, kids respond to that. You know, if you are interested in what you're doing, they get that, and they'll go along with you, even though it's a bit bumpy.
But the Bible, first of all, it is such a compilation of so many different books from so many different historical, cultural moments. So that alone, if you just recognize that, it is its own library. I love that kind of image, and it's the right image. So then the opportunity to delve into the historical moments where those oral traditions were captured, and why, and who captured them, and what wasn't there, and what was chosen to be in the canon, is such an important set of questions. But the other is variety of interpretations throughout history of where the Bible shows up and how it's used, from every culture across the globe has biblical moments in it. Sometimes in the forefront, sometimes in the background, but the Bible is a world global resource. People have used it for a whole host of things historically. They continue to use it now. So it's a powerful book. I love to introduce students to the recognition of it as a tool that people use, misuse often, utilized with great heart and soul and intention, but often misreading it, misrepresenting it, sometimes incredibly manipulatively, if that's a word, or nefariously, that people will utilize the Bible to try to really misrepresent intentionally, using the power of the Bible to say this is what this says and this is the way to interpret it in ways that are problematic. And just to have students be aware of that and help them own the critical lens to ask questions about their own interpretations as well as other people's interpretations, and to just ask the next question, well, who's saying that, and what's their background, what is their intention, how do they understand how they're translating it. That's every human tool of responsible relationship that I can imagine. To be a responsible person in the world is all the tools that's required to be a good friend, a good citizen, are embedded in the capacity to learn through the Bible. And so it's just an incredible resource.
Yeah. One of the things that I love about the letters of Paul in particular is the way in which they're getting used in contemporary society. So there's a set of continental philosophers who are using the letters of Paul now, and they tend very proudly to state at the beginning of their books that they're atheists. And yet they're reviving the letters of Paul as this key to universalism, to interventions in society, to kind of creating a level playing field for different ethnicities, races, for women to participate as well. So this question of who gets to own, to whom do these texts belong, really can be sort of exploded wide open, and the theological and the ethical potential of these texts is still there. One thing I find interesting about the use of those texts in continental philosophy right now is that they're saying, well, Paul is a Christian, and so he's uniquely presenting this kind of Christian perspective that allows for universalism. But when we think about the question of Paul as Jew or Jesus as Jew, it allows for a corrective to remind us that actually these texts were produced in an ancient context that we could learn a lot more about, could benefit a lot more from, and those messages of universalism or of sort of theological inspiration might still be there, but need to be kind of made more complicated and set within an ancient context as well as used in a modern one.
And that complicating them doesn't lessen their validity or your foothold on them in a sense. It just sort of makes another circle to keep kind of getting bigger.
Right, and it makes you, any of us, responsible for saying, okay, I accept this interpretation, or I think this is the important message to take out, and the letters of Paul or biblical texts either support or don't support that, but let me take responsibility for the kind of stance I want to take in relation to this material, whether it's that they make it easier or harder for me to make that interpretation, that intervention in the world. So.
I love your language of taking responsibility for your interpretation. I think that's just something that's really good to practice no matter what, about any interpretation, but I think especially about the Bible. It's a really great phrase that I think students would respond really well to. So giving them the respect to say, you have the capacity to take responsibility for this. Treating them as people who have that both ability and that we have the expectation of them. I think they respond really well to being taken that seriously.
As you think about secondary education in the U.S. or K through 12 in general in the U.S., what are some really good resources to which you would point people for teaching the Bible or teaching religion? And this may be a little bit uncomfortable for Diane, because one of the resources was actually authored by you, and I've read it and I think it's tremendous, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, or others that have strengths and weaknesses.
Great, well, thank you. And I didn't author the whole thing, but I was the head of this task force in the American Academy of Religion that did create guidelines and published in 2010, aimed at K through 12 educators to help them understand both the legal questions, the pedagogical challenges of what it means to teach about religion, to give them language and tools, really, to teach about religion in all different contexts. We focus on, again, it's K through 12, so we've got primary, middle, and secondary school foci. We are looking primarily at English language arts and history, both in those contexts, although it's relevant for other disciplines as well. And we provide little snapshots of practice, so they have vignettes to not only say this is one way to look at how to do this, but we also show them what this looks like in a classroom, so that we've got lots of very concrete examples that we've been really pleased that educators who've had a chance to review it and use it have found helpful. And then the other resource that I find really helpful, and educators have also represented real appreciation for, is the Society for Biblical Literature, which is the scholarly association for biblical studies scholars specifically, is this one that is in front of you, Laura, and I'm sorry, I don't...
The Bible Electives in Public Schools.
The Bible
Guide.
Electives in Public Schools, and that provides an overview, again, of different ways to think about the Bible, and it has a very useful question and answer for frequently asked questions about how to teach about the Bible. There are a couple other resources out there that that are not as helpful, that I think that in the legal domain, one that teachers should really try to avoid. It's a National Curriculum for Bible in Public Schools. It's a curriculum that's focused on a particular religious interpretation of the Bible, which again is very appropriate for churches and particular theological contexts, but not appropriate for public schools. And teachers should avoid that one. And then another that is the Bible and its interpreters, which is one that, again, we'd just encourage you to think more broadly about the possibilities in the Bible. But the AAR guidelines and that Society for Biblical Literature guidelines for teachers are really helpful.
I want to emphasize that one thing that I found particularly useful about the guidelines for teaching about religion on the American Academy of Religion website are the examples that you gave. So these concrete moments, how does, Ms. K in 4th grade handle this topic in American history or this topic in social studies? I know in my first years of teaching, I was so exhausted and so overwhelmed by the possibilities and wanting to see examples from people who had done work like this, and I found that really helpful. Also, on the Society of Biblical Literature website, a lot of scholars who teach at the college and university level have actually uploaded syllabi. And those are for college or university level, but many of them probably have good lesson plans, examples, literature that could be pulled back into even a K through 12 classroom. So.
And the Society of Biblical Literature has also had a very robust task force on its own right to focus resources for K through 12 teachers. So they have had an active website. I know that there's archives of the resources that many scholars have helped put forward for teachers on the SBL website that I'm sure we can reference in a link related to this encounter. So,
Thank you.
So again, there's some good material out there.
In some states, the Bible is actually mandated to be taught in the public schools, which raises a really interesting and urgent question for teachers: how do we do this well? And one state in which it's mandated is Texas, I think, as of 2007. And one scholar who's been really active about talking about this is Dr. Mark Chancey, and he's a professor at Southern Methodist University in Texas. And so he's doing work in his own college and university classrooms, but he's also really helping teachers in K through 12 to navigate the way in which the Bible might be productively used in a classroom in these states, in which that's really, mandated and important. So I've been appreciating learning from his work as well. So we were talking about some of the dangers or some of the fears people might have as they think about how do you teach the Bible in a public school classroom. What are some of the ways in which you have been thinking, you and other scholars have been thinking about how to guide people through that process?
There are 3 fundamental assertions that we lay out in the AAR guidelines that are helpful for teachers to know. Well, 4 actually. One is that always what I already spoke about was that important for teachers to understand and for them to convey to their students a distinction between the devotional expression of a religious tradition or the devotional interpretation of the Bible, and then the study of a religious tradition or the study of the Bible, which means recognizing and giving credibility to diverse interpretations. And that is, in my experience, as long as students understand that and teachers understand that, that really helps everybody be clear. These are different ways to approach this literature and appropriate in each of their contexts. But in the public schools, it is the study of the Bible, the study of religion. 3 fundamental facts about religion in general that are just kind of thumbnail sketches for teachers. One is to remember that religious traditions are internally diverse. They're not uniform. And so anytime you hear someone say, Muslims believe or Christians believe, we hope that by the end of a unit on the Bible or unit on religion that students would learn, well, there's a little red flag because that assumes there's a uniformity. The second is that religions evolve and change and that they are not static and ahistorical. So when we learn about often, unfortunately, again, in schools, we learn about religion through ritual practice that appears to be static and ahistorical and the same throughout time. So if you learn about the 10 Commandments or the 4 Noble Truths in Buddhism or the 5 Pillars in Islam, it's as though you understand something about those traditions. And you understand a very little bit, but not very much, because it assumes, again, this ahistorical framework. So religions change in different cultural, historical context. Interpretations of the Bible change through history, through different cultural moments. So just to help students remember that, and then just always keep that in mind. And then the last one is that religion is embedded in all dimensions of human experience. And that challenges the notion, we think, well, religion lives in a very private place here, and then there's political and economic life that is distinct from that. And that assumption actually is based on a misunderstanding of secularism. And we don't have time to go into all this now, but the key is that religious ideologies, influences, and belief systems are embedded and run throughout every dimension of human experience, sometimes negatively, sometimes positively, sometimes explicitly, sometimes more implicitly. But religion, like other forms of human expression, you can't isolate in a separate place. It's just impossible to do. And if you think in that way, then the study of religion is really you can ask, as we mentioned earlier, the religion question of just about anything, and you'll have an answer to it if you ask what are the religious influences here. So if teachers can think about those things, and we outline those in the AAR guidelines, it might be helpful as just thumbnails to shape the nature of what they would like their students to come away from thinking methodologically about what it means to study religion.
One thing I found helpful with every class, once we would establish norms for how we were going to discuss the Bible each day, this last year that I taught it, we put the norms up on the screen and said, let's just remind ourselves, once again, there's no such thing as a bad question. That's not, just go through every single day. Yeah. So we're kind of washing the slate clean each time so we can approach it in the way that we want to with intention.
That's right.
I hope I remember to do that again this year.
Oh, yeah, that's a great practice. Yeah, absolutely.